Very good. Wonderful. Thank you so much today, everyone, for coming today to our session on Reclaiming the Narrative, teaching about Native American boarding schools. This is part 2, and our session today is geared on grades 6 through 8. Again, this is a fantastic partnership with the Arizona Department of Education Academic Standards Unit, the Office of Indian Education here at ADE, the Phoenix Indian Boarding Schools Visitor Center, and the Association, or excuse me, Administration of Native Americans. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Helen.
Thank you, Linda. Okay, so just like in part 1 of our session, we will be introducing ourselves a little bit formally in just a second, but we want to take a few minutes to also engage with some land acknowledgements. We're going to ask in just a moment that you do a brief land acknowledgement in addition to your introduction. I can see a lot of people are sharing their names, their roles, and the organizations that they're with, which we appreciate. And in just a moment, you can go ahead and include your land acknowledgement as well. And you can do that just in addition to everything else you've shared. And in part 1, we showed you all a video about the importance of land acknowledgements and showed a variety of Indigenous voices and perspectives on land acknowledgements. And so we will drop the link in the chat to that video, but we won't be watching it again today just for the sake of time. And as a reminder, you can go back and watch part 1, the recording of part 1, using the link that Linda sent out in her email reminder for today. And you'll have access to all of those resources as well after this session. And so as we're introducing ourselves, a lot of you are already doing this. Please go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat. And if you haven't done so yet, please recognize or name the tribal nation closest to you or on whose ancestral homelands you currently live and work. I'm just going to briefly take a moment to introduce myself. So I'm Petu Washte, Helen Wape, Thomas Ima Chape, Kusto, Malakota Kusto, Chante Washte, Nape, Chiazapi. So hello, good day. My name is Helen Thomas. I am the Professional Learning Coordinator for the Office of Indian Education. I introduced myself in Lakota. I am Hunkpapa Lakota, which is just one band of Lakota, which is a part of the larger Oceti Shakopee Confederacy, but I'm a citizen of the Standing Rock Sioux tribe. And it's really important to me to introduce myself in Lakota in these spaces because I was taught to do that by my grandmother, who was an educator, Lakota language educator, and also in relation today was a boarding school survivor. So I think it's really important to begin with my own native language. And I'm really grateful to be partnering with Linda. So I will give her a chance to introduce herself as well.
Hello, everyone. My name is Linda Burrows, and I'm the Director for K-12 Social Studies and World and Native Languages here at the Department of Education. I am very pleased to have you all here with us today to share in this learning environment. I am going to do an acknowledgement for our land that ADE sits on, and we would like to acknowledge that the Arizona Department of Education is located on the ancestral homelands of the Akimel Otham and Peepash peoples. We recognize that the Akimel Otham and Peepash peoples are the past, present, and future caretakers of this land. And we also acknowledge that without their knowledge and contributions, we would not be able to survive on these lands as guests today. We'd also like to acknowledge that Phoenix metropolitan area is home to one of the largest urban Native populations in the United States. We'd also like to acknowledge our community partners who are not with us today. Melita Yazi is from the Phoenix Indian School Center, and she has been integral to this part of preparing this professional learning opportunity for you. And we also want to recognize Professor Manuel Pino, who, if you watching in the part 1 video, was really integral to helping us bring in the context of the Native American boarding schools and the larger picture of American history and federal policy towards Native American peoples.
Thank you, Linda. So thank you everyone that's dropping their introductions in the chat. We really appreciate you doing that. And it's not just for us, we want you all to know who's in the space with you. And with that being said, We will be asking you to engage with each other in the chat through reflections or in small group discussions and breakout rooms today. And so we do want to start with some community agreements, just so we have some understanding of how we're going to be in relationship with each other today. The first agreement is that we're all here to learn. And with that agreement comes the understanding that we recognize that some of us are coming into this space with a variety of lived experience, maybe professional experience, teaching or learning about this topic, but that for others, this may be the first time that you're getting an opportunity to talk and learn and teach about this topic. And we want to honor wherever you're at in your journey and just know that we're grateful that you're here in this space with us. We also want to agree that everyone brings valuable knowledge and experience regardless of where you are at in your learning journey. And so when you're in those breakout rooms, please honor the knowledge that's shared with you, respect that. You don't necessarily need to share that with others if it's somebody's personal experience, but that we're just being very respectful of everybody's expertise. Of course, please take care of yourself and others. We're in a virtual learning environment, so we know that needs come up. We encourage you to do that. But we also want to use this agreement to think of how we're being trauma informed in this session. And so we want to just offer somewhat of a content warning around the fact that this is a heavy topic and a lot of emotional responses can come up, especially for those of us that have personal connections. And so again, please take what you need. And if you need to step away or process that information in a different way, we respect that. And specifically, we would really like to honor the Indigenous educators in our space and recognize that you probably already have a lot of, again, lived experiences or background knowledge around this topic. And so we want to honor that and recognize that. Lastly, because we have a limited amount of time, please expect and accept non-closure. This is just a starting point, and we're hoping you'll walk away today with a variety of resources, tools, and language that you can use to continue your teaching and learning in regards to Native American boarding schools. And with that, I will turn it over to Linda to talk a little bit more about what we're doing today.
So for our agenda today, we've gone through our welcome and introductions, and then next we're going to review what culturally responsive and trauma-informed teaching looks like, what that means. Those terms get thrown around a lot. We also are going to explore a bunch of resources that we have vetted and looked through that will be excellent for you to use in your classrooms to teach about Native American boarding schools. And then we're also going to look at how these resources and how Native American boarding schools really fit and tie into the standards. And then last, we'll just have some quick closing reflections. And so Helen and I have really worked hard to have some learning outcomes for you today. We really want for you to have an understanding and explore what trauma-informed, culturally responsive, as well as culturally sustaining, what that means, those terms. And then develop, look what a really developmentally appropriate resources look like for middle school students. We'll also brainstorm ideas about how to use these and integrate these into social studies classes, because we're not expecting you to completely rewrite your curriculums and scope and sequences, but to insert this information where you can and where it's appropriate. And the last, we really want you to leave the session with some confidence in your ability to teach about Native American boarding schools and to be more trauma informed as we go forward.
And so we'd like to start by getting an idea of where you're at in your understanding of these topics. So in just a moment, Linda will drop a link in the chat and for you to anonymously respond to these prompts. But what we're asking is, what do you already know about culturally responsive or sustaining and or trauma-informed teaching? Have you already had some training in these topics? Are these conversations or topics that are coming up at your school sites? Or do you have practices that you're already incorporating into your instruction that you believe are culturally responsive and trauma-informed? We'd also like you to reflect on what questions you're bringing into the space regarding teaching about Native American boarding schools specifically. We want to ensure that we are meeting your needs and that we're responsive, and we know that that starts with hearing directly from you first. So we will take just a few minutes to fill out the Mentimeter link and share your responses. And you can submit more than once. So if you'd like to submit a response to the top prompt first and then do another submission, to share your questions, that's totally fine. And then if we have anyone who's joining us from their mobile device, or anyone who's unable to access the link, just know that you can always share your responses directly in the chat. But we know that sometimes having that opportunity to respond anonymously allows us to be a little more vulnerable and a little more, I guess, transparent in our responses. And so with that, I'm going to check on the Mentimeter. Okay. So we have some responses coming in. Some people have some training on trauma informed. Some people sharing that they've been doing this work at an individual level and hoping that it would be at a district level as well. A free 6-hour training, and that's great. If you want to share the link to that free 6-hour training in the chat, that's one way that we see that agreement of taking care of each other. If you have relevant resources or learning opportunities that you think connect to what we're talking to, please drop them in the chat for everyone else to benefit from as well. Oh, thank you to those that are sharing that they haven't received formal training, but they have background knowledge from family members who are survivors. And I think that we want to be very clear that we view that background knowledge as just as valuable as any formal training that you may have engaged in. We'll speak a little bit later about how we're hoping to affirm Indigenous ways of knowing and being, and we know that those lived experiences are really valuable sources of knowledge as well. Someone shared in the chat that they are still learning about trauma-informed practices, but they do know that culturally responsive practices involve deep listening and checking personal biases. Thank you so much. These are really great reflections. And it helps us at the agency to know that you all are interested in having these conversations. You've chosen to be here in the space with us today, but that you haven't had maybe a lot of opportunities outside of this space to have training in this area. Nice, and some great questions around where you can find more resources. And I will say that you will be getting a number of resources today, and we'll be sharing one link where you can access them all towards the end of our session today. And there is over 40 different websites, lesson plans, links that you can explore and use in your classroom. All right. Thank you so much to everyone who is responding in the Mentimeter. We really appreciate your participation and your engagement with this topic. Sorry, I'm using a different mouse that I'm not used to using. It's a little slow.
So now we're going to go ahead and transition into our culturally responsive and trauma-informed guidance. We're going to provide you a brief overview of how the Arizona Office of Indian Education defines these terms and what this teaching looks like. We'll also be looking at some guidance from the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum as well.
Yeah, so to start off, we would like to share how the Arizona Office of Indian Education has been defining culturally responsive education or culturally responsive teaching and learning. And so this is a working definition, but we currently use this to describe what we mean by culturally responsive instruction. So it's instruction that's informed by and/or intentionally integrates cultural strengths in order to master Arizona state standards. And to give you more of an idea of what we mean by cultural strengths, there's a number of terms out there that could be used to describe this. You may be familiar with funds of knowledge or community cultural wealth, ways of knowing and being specific within Indigenous communities. But really all these is not only what students know about when they come into our classroom, the kinds of topics and concepts that they're familiar with, but also, just as importantly, how they come to know those things in their home environment, in their community. So these can look like routines, communication styles, and information processing strategies that our students are bringing with them into the classroom. And the Arizona Office of Indian Education is actually moving towards using the language of culturally sustaining and revitalizing education. And what we mean by that is that both the home and mainstream cultural knowledge and ways of being are valued and maintained, nurtured, and sustained in the schooling environment. And so we, like I said, want to be very intentional, and we actually see a lot of connections to the topic that we're here to talk about today. And so we want to ask and give you a chance to reflect, given what we learned in part 1 of this series about how Indigenous and Native American students' cultures were treated in the boarding schools. Why is it important to include that word revitalizing in addition to the word sustaining? So we'll give you a moment to reflect in the chat. Why, in the context of Native education specifically, would we include that word revitalizing? Thank you to those that are sharing resources in the chat as well. Definitely appreciate that. So as a reminder, in part 1, we learned about the practices that happened in the boarding schools, the policies that were enacted, not just in relation to boarding schools, but historically to Indigenous peoples generally. So things like the relocation movement, the termination era, all these legislative acts and Supreme Court cases that have influenced the way that Native people have been treated by the federal government and the relationship they have. Thank you so much, Joanne. Joanne wrote in the chat, we need to bring back lost language and culture that were lost due to past treatment of our Indigenous peoples, like boarding schools and damaging laws. Thank you so much, Joanne. That perfectly sums it up. We at the Office of Indian Education think it's really critical to include the word sustaining and revitalizing, specifically to acknowledge that a lot of these this cultural knowledge and ways of being and knowing have historically been damaged and removed in schooling institutions. So we want to be very intentional that we support the sustaining of those and the reclaiming and revitalization of that.
You do see that movement further, by the federal government now starting to recognize the importance of it and devoting money, time, and resources to national language resource centers to start bringing back and purposefully trying to restore some of that lost language and culture due to the boarding schools and other, damaging federal policies.
Yeah, thank you so much, Linda, for that context. That's really, again, bringing in the national perspective right into this topic. And I also want to acknowledge those that are in the chat saying so much harm was done, a lot of action was taken to assimilate Native peoples, that there was a stigma around Native ways of being and knowing as being viewed as less than the dominant society. And it's important to acknowledge that Native people have and will always have value. Thank you so much. These are great reflections, and we really appreciate you taking the time to make those connections between what we're talking about today and what we learned in part 1. And so a helpful way to start thinking about being culturally responsive or culturally sustaining is to reflect on what aspects of our students' cultures are we considering or are we integrating into our curriculum and instruction. And this is not just applicable to our Indigenous students, but to everyone, right? Even to ourselves. We all have a cultural frame of reference, and this analogy here can help us kind of be more intentional and reflective. And so this is an analogy of a tree as representing the 3 levels of culture. You may have been familiar with the iceberg analogy, which is where they use an iceberg to describe the 3 levels, although I prefer a tree, and I will speak to that in just a moment, a little bit more why. But there are 3 levels of culture, the first being the surface level, which is represented by the leaves. And these are the observable features, things like food and holidays that everybody can kind of see. And then the trunk represents the shallow level, which is unspoken norms and protocols. And while these are not as obvious, they can still be discerned through careful observation, deep listening, like someone mentioned earlier, and inquiry. when we're building relationships with people in that culture, right? But the last level of culture, the deep level represented by the roots, are really those collective beliefs and values that are foundational to our ways of knowing and being. And often these are only identifiable by by those who are active participants within that culture. And even then takes a lot of reflection, I think, to identify what do those features of the culture actually look and sound and feel like. And so, as I mentioned, sometimes people like to use the iceberg analogy to describe culture, but I prefer a tree because I think it speaks to how dynamic cultures are, right? A tree changes in relation to the environment that it's in, to the changing seasons, and cultures are like that as well. We want to emphasize that we are viewing cultures as a dynamic thing that changes based on that particular person within the culture's relationship to their community or their own experiences. And then even within one community or culture, people are going to demonstrate these different levels in different ways. And so the analogy of culture as a tree comes from Zaretta Hammond's 2015 book, Culturally Responsive Teaching and the Brain. And in that book, Hammond notes that historically, most of the integrations of culture into our schooling have mostly engaged with students' surface level of their cultures. So the holidays they celebrate, the foods they eat, the clothing they might wear, dances or celebrations. And while these inclusions are really important, neuroscience actually tells us that integrations of deeper levels of culture are what are going to have the most cognitive impact on our students' learning, right? It's going to be what connects most to their schema, to their prior knowledge, and really have a big impact on them learning new content. And so we want to be clear that we're not saying that to be a culturally responsive and sustaining practitioner, that you need to be an expert in your students' cultures. And in fact, a sense of cultural humility is really necessary to recognize that we as educators need to take the time to learn with and from the students we teach, their families, their communities, if we wish to really respectfully integrate their cultural strengths into the classroom. And so this really starts with reflecting on our own cultural background and considering how it influences our choices as teachers. And then when we model that sense of inquiry and humility, it teaches students the importance of cultural competency, and that building cultural competency, not only within our own cultural identity, but that of others, is a lifelong skill and journey that really has no end. And so one way that we at the Arizona Office of Indian Education promote the development of cultural competency or culturally sustaining practices for Indigenous students is to encourage teachers to have a working understanding of Indigenous knowledge systems. And so when we affirm Indigenous knowledge systems, which is really another way of saying Indigenous ways of knowing, of learning, of transferring and sharing knowledge, of demonstrating knowledge that may be different from dominant culture or mainstream culture, we are doing that work of building our cultural competency, right? And so this particular term, Indigenous knowledge systems, comes from higher education, but we use it specifically so that if you're interested in learning more, you can search this term and find more resources. Although we want to be clear that we say Indigenous knowledge systems, it's intentionally plural to recognize that within each specific unique tribal nation or Indigenous community, these knowledge systems are going to look different because they're very much place-based and rooted in community and kinship. And so when we look at traditional Indigenous education approaches, we can see some major traits that cut across all of our communities. However, if we want to learn more, we have to do that in the context of the place and the community that we're specifically working with or serving. However, we do want you all to consider how some of these traits of bringing in balanced, holistic, dynamic and responsive, experiential and contextualized, And then also relational and interconnected approaches can be used to talk about Native American boarding schools, because not only do we want to talk about revitalizing Indigenous ways of knowing and being, but it's really powerful when we can give students and learners the opportunity to experience what that can feel like to affirm Indigenous knowledge systems in our classrooms. And so we will touch on this a little bit later as well. But the reason we include this particular slide is because this aligns well with some other guidance that we've provided in a few of our other summer professional learnings.
So we wanted to share with you the National Council for Social Studies position statement with regards to teaching and being culturally responsive. And there are 7 recommendations that Helen and I focused on a previous training that has been recorded. And so if you missed that, you can go back and watch that. We will be posting them online next week. And they have 7 really good recommendations for how to be kind of culturally responsive and to keep that in mind as you go forward. And the one that we really wanted to point out is number 5 today, that idea of affirming Indigenous knowledges. Like Helen just said, there is definitely more than one way to learn, and that knowing that this and recognizing it other than what the mainstream or dominant culture does is an important thing to take a first step going forward.
Yes, so now that we've kind of given you a brief overview of how we are defining culturally responsive and sustaining approaches, we also want to dive a little bit more into this idea of being trauma informed. So from your reflections, it seems like a lot of people have either had a bit of training or have done a little bit of looking into trauma informed approaches. But as a reminder, we showed you this slide at the end of part 1. And the intention with showing this slide was to highlight the fact that as classroom teachers, we don't necessarily need to know the specifics of the trauma that certain students are working through, but instead it's our responsibility to be mindful of how that trauma can impact the learning environment and the learning process in our classrooms. And so we're definitely not encouraging you to play trauma detective in any way and determine which of your students and their families may have been directly impacted by Native American boarding schools. But instead, in part 1, we asked you to think about and consider your role as an educator within the public schooling system and how learning about this history of Native American boarding schools influenced the way that you thought about your role. And so in the last row of the left-hand side of this chart that shows trauma-informed traits, it says that trauma-informed education recognizes that trauma is omnipresent and emphasizes a shared responsibility to mitigate the impact. And so we want to talk a little bit more specifically about our responsibility, our role as classroom teachers, and what is within our control to be trauma-informed in the classroom, especially when we're talking about topics that are very heavy, like Native American boarding schools. And so one part of being trauma-informed is recognizing that certain topics like this can re-traumatize or can cause harm to students if they're not accompanied by intentional instruction and planning, right? So as teachers, we have the opportunity to hold space, but also provide students with the tools and the language to make meaning from the true history of topics like Native American boarding schools. And we feel that this 2021 article from First Nation Indigenous educator Suzanne Methot offers some really wonderful considerations for when we are teaching about topics like Native American boarding schools. And so she recommends when teaching about topics that can elicit emotional responses, that one way we can prepare for that is to consider how are we going to help students make meaning from those emotions. And her big recommendation is to use inquiry and academic discussions to process information, but also process those emotional reactions. And we really appreciate that she advocates for inquiry because we know that's an approach that's definitely addressed in our standards and what we're advocating for here at the agency. And then additionally, academic discussions are a great way to build off of the oral traditions that many of our Indigenous, but also other students from other communities bring with them into the classroom. She has some specific recommendations around what you might do to prepare for those kinds of discussion, which is to consider the prompts and the questions you're going to pose and try to work outward from the self, really having students reflect on themselves. So for example, the way that we posed questions to you in part 1 to really consider your role as an educator and how that changes your understanding, the way you're making meaning about the history of federal Indian boarding schools, and then work outward from the self back to have a more nuanced understanding of history. She also recommends avoiding centering non-Indigenous people and their feelings and really shift more towards relationships and responsibility. So again, in part 1, our other big guiding question that we asked you to consider was, how does this information not only change the way you're thinking about your role, but also about your responsibility towards Indigenous students, families, communities, and really tribal nations broadly as a public educator. And then lastly, her last recommendation that we feel is very powerful is this idea of portraying Indigenous peoples with agency. And I really appreciate this recommendation because we know that historically, the few representations that Native peoples do get within K-12 education, they're often having their story, their perspectives told by someone else. And so when we portray Indigenous peoples with agency, we're really centering their perspectives. We're showing them as people who made decisions, not only for themselves, but for their communities. And it also really pushes back against that deficit mindset that has historically been a part of those representations. And so we ask that you consider throughout our session today how some of the resources we're showing you can portray Indigenous peoples with agency.
So we also wanted to bring to your attention another guideline that really fits well with this idea of being trauma informed. And this comes from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. And this is their framework that they give towards viewing the Holocaust and what that looks like. And a lot of these guidelines really make sense and are applicable to studying other traumatic events like the Native American boarding schools. So a couple of these I'm just going to point out. We can, let's see here, I've got it in the chat and I will, there you go, you can look at it for yourself. But a couple of these are important. And one, the idea of vocabulary and language, like Helen had mentioned earlier, is important. So making sure that you define terms and that you have some precision with your language is a very important thing, considering as you consider teaching issues that have caused historic trauma. You also want to avoid simple answers to complex questions. And we got a lot of that from Professor Pino giving us that extra context in part 1. The idea of comparisons of pain is also not something that you want to do when you are teaching about historically difficult subjects. And the best way to look at it is not necessarily in comparison, which one was tougher, but more of making connections between difficult events, and that you can see maybe some of the decisions that were made by governments that were similar, or some of the effects or impacts upon people and societies were similar to these events. Rather than making comparisons, try to make those connections. Contextualizing the history, that goes along with what I had mentioned earlier from Professor Pino, gave us that really great background in part 1. And then lastly, we also, I like the idea of translating statistics into people, right? We want to hear the stories from the people themselves. Let Indigenous peoples tell their own stories about what happened to Native American boarding schools, and keeping that in mind. And then lastly, the idea of making responsible methodological choices. And so these are things that we'll talk about as we go further on in our session, looking at resources. Are they historically accurate or inaccurate? Does it align with your standards? Are you hearing the voice? Is it respectful to victims and survivors? And you also want to look at what kind of point of view is being told from the story. And this relates to, for example, a lot of teachers use the boy in striped pajamas to teach about the Holocaust as an example, but actually that's not really the best story or narrative to tell, because it's actually not from the narrative of a survivor or even from a Jewish person who went through the Holocaust. It's actually from a little German boy. And so it's not really, while it's an interesting book and is telling some of the Holocaust, right, it's not necessarily a great narrative to use when you're talking about those sorts of things. So we just want to keep those concepts in mind as we're teaching about difficult subjects.
Yes, thank you, Linda. And we will highlight, you'll see all of these points highlighted throughout the resources that we share in the rest of the session. Before we move on to highlighting some of the resources that you can use and the approaches you might take, we want to give you a chance to, one, reflect on the information that was just shared, again, make meaning of it. But again, in this, with our intention to affirm Indigenous ways of knowing and being, we're asking that we use an Indigenous style of communication, a protocol for communication in this next activity. We're going to send you into small groups in breakout rooms of about 4 to 5 people and ask that you follow a talking circle protocol, which really just means that you are allowing each person in the space the opportunity to respond to the prompts on the screen or respond to the information that was just shared, and that you share your response and then you step back and give someone else the space to share their responses before you have any building on of each other's responses, or you elaborate. Really make sure you're giving everybody the time to respond first, and then you can definitely go into further discussion. But this is both an equitable and inclusive approach, and we also want to note that we have these 2 prompts on the screen of how might we apply a culturally sustaining and revitalizing and or trauma-informed approach to teaching specifically about boarding schools and what might be some challenges. But if you have a different reflection that is coming up based on the information that was just shared, it's completely appropriate to share that as well. We want this space to be relevant and meaningful to you, so we're giving you that autonomy. Please take a moment to introduce yourself just briefly, because you will be coming back to these groups a little bit later on as well.
I'm going to go ahead and pause the recording.
All right, so thank you everybody for taking a quick break. We hope you were able to take care of your needs. And so now we're really going to transition into exploring not only the resources that we've gathered for you all, but we've really organized them into a variety of different types of resources that you can use to learn and teach about Native American boarding schools.
So we're going to start really first with media literacy, and I'm actually starting to call this information literacy, just to make it a little bit more broad. And it's the idea of the, what's the word I'm thinking of? The responsibility that we have as educators to teach our students to be knowledgeable consumers and producers of content, especially as middle school teachers, having been a middle school teacher myself. It's the students are at that age where they really are starting to consume massive amounts of media, right? Of all different kinds of information. And so teaching them to be responsible consumers as to who created this message, what techniques were used to gain my attention, how might different people understand the same message, I think is a really good one. What values and lifestyles and points of view are represented in the message, as well as anytime our students share information and they are then producers of it. And so getting them to understand that responsibility, that when they share that information, they are doing that same thing as a producer, right? What content am I putting forth out there? What message am I reflecting? Who might interpret my message differently and why? And it really comes down to teaching students to read laterally, which we have this link here. And this comes from the group that did the Stanford History Education group. And they've got a new product out called Civic Online Reasoning. And it's really all about teaching students to read laterally. So instead of just opening a source and reading all the way to the bottom and figuring out, okay, this isn't one that works, the first thing you do is you open a new tab and find out who created it. You opened another tab to find out who wrote something else about it, and you open another tab, and you may open 3 or 4 different tabs doing your research on that source before you even get to reading all of that. And in doing that, our students will become very responsible consumers and then producers of media. So it's a great message that we need to teach our students, but it also comes to this where we want to make sure that we are using responsible resources in our classroom to teach especially difficult subjects that have historical trauma associated with them.
Yes, thank you so much, Linda. And I hope you all see the connections between media or information literacy and how this approach can be used with all the different types of resources that we are going to highlight. And so the first kind of resource we want to highlight is the opportunity to use maps when teaching about Native American boarding schools, specifically for their ability to connect to place. So as I noted in the section on Indigenous knowledge systems, Indigenous peoples have long-standing relationships with certain places and the non-human beings that they share those places with, including animals, plants, land, and waterways. And so bringing maps as a primary source into your instruction about Native American boarding schools is a great way to contextualize this topic by providing insights into a place at a particular time and or demonstrating how places and understanding of places can change over time. And we encourage you to contextualize this topic by prioritizing the particular place in which you and your students are learning. You might do this by exploring how Native American boarding schools influence the local area around you before zooming out to show that boarding schools were not only a national phenomena, but actually happened on a global scale to Indigenous peoples in Canada, New Zealand, and Australia, in addition to the United States. And so the use of maps also allows us to make really clear connections between the removal of children in Indigenous communities and the process of land dispossession. And again, Professor Pino highlighted that point again and again in the part 1 session. And so now Linda is going to take you through a protocol for exploring maps that you can use in your own classroom that we feel gets at that media literacy and is going to help you really dive deeper into the topic of Native American boarding schools.
Thank you. So we're going to use a method that I like, and it honestly can be used for any sort of primary source that you may use in your classroom. And so we are using here a excerpt. It's actually one of the appendices from the Truth and Healing Commission that did on Native American boarding schools that the Secretary of the Interior, Deb Haaland, just put together. And they're keep putting out more and more of these, but this is the first one that just came out. And so what I'd like for you to do is pretend you're a 6th grade student, a 7th grade student, an 8th grade student. And I want you to just observe, what do you see on this map? No analysis, no, trying to figure things out. Just what do you see as a middle school student? What do you see on this map? And go ahead and type your answer for me into the chat, please. Bunch of dots. Patterns, excellent. Clusters in certain areas. Group of dots, yep. Clusters, definitely. Some places have more dots than others. Excellent. Text on the map. A map of the US. Yeah, most middle school students should be able to figure out that's the US. Plus it actually says it's from the US Department of Interior. Yeah, maps of specific areas. Fantastic. So this is this first piece of this, right? We want our kids to just observe what they see. And you can actually prompt them a little bit more by asking your kids, well, what did you notice first? What size and shape is the map? What kind of geographical elements do you see? Is there anything on the map that looks strange or unfamiliar? Is there anything on the map that looks like it doesn't belong? What places does the map show? And then also look at the words, what wording is being used by the map. And so I think that's a great picture, right, of what's going on. So after the observation, and thank you, whoever said that Alaska and Hawaii are missing, right? What we want our kids to reflect. And so this is the next step of this process. And again, you can use this for any kind of primary source. So when we're reflecting now and we look at this map, you want to ask yourself, different kinds of questions, like what do you see going on this map? What do you think is happening on this map? So take a minute and now do some reflection for me.
And some people are having some issues with messages sending directly to me. Just know that if you do send me a direct message on accident, I'll just share it with the rest of the group. That way everyone can, I know some people are calling in from their phones or other devices, so no worries.
So what do you folks think is going on with this map? What's happening here? What is the message that the U.S. Department of Interior is trying to convey? And so these are some of these questions, right, that you want to have your students ask. Things like, can you compare this to, different maps? What does this tell you about the people creating the map? Obviously, this is a current map that was just created, but what's great is you can take it and look, when you look at older primary sources or older maps, right, how might that be different today than it was in the past? And so that's another kind of comparative example that you can do with it. And then after we do the reflection, we really want to get our students into this questioning mode going forward, right? What is going on? What do you wonder about with this map? What happened here? What is the, what happened to the people, right? When did this take place? When, where, why, how, all of those kind of questions that we really want students to do that kind of investigation that will then lead them to other resources and other stories to learn about. And the idea is that we're putting that onus on the kids, right? The kids are doing that work, not us. Exactly. So you've got more boarding schools in Oklahoma and in the Four Corners area. Well, why is that, right? That would be a perfect example to get at. Also boundaries, right? The idea of boundaries and state lines is something that's so completely foreign to Indigenous ways of thinking. And so investigating that and why are they all huddled in one area and what did that do to other peoples, right, is really interesting and different. So this is a process that comes from the Library of Congress, and I'm putting a link into the chat here. And you can click on that, and that link will take you to their website where they will have guidelines that basically you can use for any kind of primary source you'd use in your classroom, whether it's a photograph, whether it's a political cartoon, whether it's an oral story, again, getting to some of those Indigenous ways of thinking, whether you're using a document, right? You can use it. And it's honestly, it's my go-to thing to do when I have a substitute, because I can leave a really rich primary source document with my kids and the sub can guide them through this. Plus, as you do these activities over and over and over again with your kids, each time they do it, they're going to get deeper understanding. They're going to get better at asking questions. And so in doing that, it's a fantastic way that's like, I'm not losing days and times with my kids. They're doing some still great work with primary sources, even though I may have, a doctor's appointment or something where I need to take a day off. So that's just one methodology that you can use to talk about Indian boarding schools. This would be great you could do it in 8th grade when you're talking about federal policies. You could use this in 7th grade when you're talking about Indigenous peoples around the world, especially as you're looking at colonization. And you could compare this to maps of boarding schools in Canada, like Helen mentioned, or maps of what happened to Aboriginals in Australia and to the Maori in New Zealand. And were there other examples of when colonizers came in to try and remove that culture and that land disposition from people in other places in the world, because there are Indigenous peoples all over the world that have been displaced by different governments at one point in time. You've got the Hmong in Southeast Asia, you've got the Ainu in Japan, you've got peoples in South Africa that were displaced by the Dutch and the British, right? You've got Indigenous peoples in the Americas and Central and South America. So there are lots of examples that you could use in like a 6th grade world history class, right? So there are lots of options to go forward with this.
Yes, and I do want to note, some people asking why Hawaii and Alaska are missing. I'm not quite sure why the U.S. Department of Interior didn't have them included on this particular graphic, but their report does include information on the many boarding schools that were in Alaska and Hawaii as well. And so another way we want to highlight this particular resource, because we feel it's just so rich, and it was published just in May of 2022, is that the appendix C of the Federal Boarding School Initiative Investigative Report also includes maps by state. And so again, you can engage in these maps by exploring your own positionality as a learning community in relation to where boarding schools are. So you might do some kind of map annotation activity where you find your location on the map and then talk about which boarding schools are closest to you. And we'll highlight a little bit later on how you can get a little more information on those particular school sites as well from the report. And we know that there's just so many ways you can do this digitally, in person. There's some questions in the chat, which again, the report actually has really great information that we'll touch on later on that could answer some of those questions.
And I did just pull it up. They do have Alaska and Hawaii, not as the continental United States, but then on the very next second page of it, if you click on the link in the chat, it's right there.
Yes, and it's super important to not erase the Indigenous peoples in that space and the unique history and relationship that Alaska Natives and Native Hawaiian people have with the federal government, as it is slightly different than the rest of the 576 federally recognized tribes in the United States. But we do, as we mentioned earlier, maps are also a great way to make the connection between Native American boarding schools and the land loss experienced by tribal nations. And so the Indian Land Cessions graphic that you see here on the slide on the left-hand side actually comes from one of the curricula that we will be highlighting later on. But these are a great way to look at changes over time, right? And to see really how, with the inclusion of more federal Indian boarding schools, what was going on with land cessions and making, like Linda said, connections across those two things happening and helping students see how they are related, which again ties into our Indigenous ways of knowing and being, where in many Indigenous knowledge systems, the parts are really looked at in relation to all other parts, not necessarily in silos and in decontextualized ways.
So books and articles, as Helen mentioned earlier, are a great way to bring in storytelling, which is another one of those Indigenous ways of knowing and being. And so using books and using storytelling is just a great way to bring that in. Definitely storytelling is another way that we can use it to humanize statistics and personal stories. Using books and articles that are actually written by Indigenous peoples about their experience is another way to ensure that you are centering Indigenous voices and experiences when you are teaching about the topic. And that's definitely something you want to consider as you go through that.
Yes, so we have a number of books that we're highlighting here that are both nonfiction in the sense that they are autobiographical or memoirs, but then also fictional stories that you can read with your students or take excerpts from to help them understand and really look at the issue of boarding schools from the perspective of either students who attended those boarding schools or youth, family members, relatives who have, again, older relatives who were survivors of those boarding schools. There's also some unique ways that you could think about boarding schools in here as well. So for example, the book, The Marrow Thieves, is actually a sci-fi kind of post-apocalyptic tale that touches on themes about the boarding school though throughout the entire novel. But one thing we really appreciate about it here at the Office of Indian Education is that so rarely do we see representations of Indigenous peoples in the future, right? So often our representations are very much located in the past. And so this idea of looking at Indigenous futurisms or representations of Indigenous people in the future to understand what has happened in the past is something that we definitely encourage educators to do. And Linda dropped in the chat some links to where we received some of these books. We also looked at the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition, which we will be dropping a link to a little bit later on. They have a great recommended reading list as well. Again, we want to highlight some nonfiction books that could start to be appropriate. Again, you could pull some excerpts from these to read with your middle school students, especially older middle school students. But these are scholarly works by Indigenous researchers and Indigenous studies researchers who are really looking back and trying to understand some of the experiences that were happening in American Indian boarding schools. And so you can see there are a number of works that you could draw from. We also included in our resource collection a link to a collection of articles on News ELA, Newsella, that are all targeted at contemporary movements and events within Native communities. And because the boarding school touched so many tribal communities across the United States and globally, you can very easily make connections across what's happening in a contemporary context to the boarding schools, right? So for example, this article that we have here about Native American women reclaiming their language, it would be great to make those connections to the boarding school movement and help students see how the reason why, just like we asked you earlier, the reason why Native people are needing to reclaim and revitalize their languages are because of the history of boarding schools, right? We also want to highlight this really great article that was published on Indian Country Today when the federal investigative report came out. And we just want to highlight Indian Country Today in general because they are a completely free, open access news source that really does a great job of reporting on contemporary issues that are important to Native communities. And it is housed right here in Arizona at the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism at Arizona State University. So we always want to highlight local resources as well. And so we just, again, while not all of these articles have to do directly with Native American boarding schools, there are ways to bring in a contemporary context to help your students see why it's so important that we have a good understanding of the historical context of Native American boarding schools.
So primary sources that we have are maps are not necessarily the only, primary source that we can use to teach about Native American boarding schools. We encourage you to definitely select sources with care and thoughtfulness and to use a variety of sources. Again, variety is what we really want to achieve when we use primary sources. We don't want to just strictly stick with, say, maps or with just narratives, right? You can use lots of different kinds of primary sources. Government sites are a great place to start. For example, the National Archives, Library of Congress, the National Museum of the American Indian, tribal nations themselves. The Arizona Department of or Office of Indian Education has curated all of the 22 indigenous tribes here in Arizona and has contact information that you can get online, state museums, and also there's a digital Arizona library. So there are lots of these different places you can go to find primary sources that emphasize Native American boarding schools, but other multiple perspectives that we require in our standards. And again, the idea too is bringing in that context, like what Professor Pino mentioned in part one about that systemic effort that was grounded in so many years of federal policy. And especially in like 7th and 8th grade, that's a really great place where you can talk about federal boarding school policy or federal policy towards Native Americans. But definitely you can touch upon that in a 6th grade class when you're talking about colonization and European contact, what that happened to Indigenous peoples across the globe.
And so we do want to highlight a few sources of where you can find collections of primary sources specifically around Native American boarding schools. The Library of Congress has great primary source sets that also include teacher guides, but so do smaller sites like the Carlisle Indian School Digital Resource Center, which as Professor Pino shared in part one, the Carlisle Indian School was the first industrial Indian boarding school that then became the model for many other federal Indian boarding school sites. The Digital Public Library of America also has great American Indian boarding school primary source sets, and the National Archives. Something unique about the Carlisle Indian School Digital Resource Center is that they have some primary sources that you might not find on some other sites, things like lists and ledgers, student records, and other types of sources that could really enrich your learning about this topic. And again, as Linda said, bring in a variety of perspectives and entry points to kind of thinking about this topic.
So here we wanted to highlight for you just some different primary source set analysis. And so we've talked about the Library of Congress, which I put again into the chat. We also have the National Archives, which has a great also for observe, reflect, and question. And if Helen can pull that up, we'll show you just real quick. One thing I like about the National Archives, I like them for a couple of different reasons. It's the same idea as observe, reflect, and question. And they have it, you can see, for all different types of primary sources. But I like the National Archives a little bit better for two reasons. One, they have worksheets that are geared for novice and younger students or English language learning students. And then worksheets, the same kind of guidance for students that are doing, that are more intermediate or higher level readers. And so I would use these when I had a co-taught class where I'm teaching a sophomore world history class, but I have students with IEPs that are reading at a third grade level. So I would pull up and print the early reader one to make it easier for them to understand, say, a sound recording. And then I would pull up the intermediate one and give that to the other students in the class. So that way they have a different one to kind of guide them through what they're listening to. And so that's one way that I like these a little bit better. Another way in which these I think are a little bit better than the Library of Congress ones is that they all come in Spanish. So if you have English language learners, or if maybe you teach in a dual language immersion classroom school that happens to be in Spanish, they all have information for you in Spanish, which is fantastic. So just another way to differentiate. And then heading back to the presentation, I wanted to show you Project Zero. So this is my latest and greatest. I love this website for bringing primary sources and getting kids to do that thinking. This goes with any subject, any content area. And you can see they have See, Think, Wonder is what they call it, but it's essentially observe, reflect, and question. But you can get any kind of primary source, and it gives you guidelines on what to do, how to do it, what's the purpose, and what that works best for sources. So it's all different options for you to maybe bring in inquiry and using multiple perspectives in your classroom. And we're going to do one of these with you here in a source in just a minute, but you can see it's just this. It's my new favorite website. I'm not going to lie. It's just, there's so much here that you can, if you feel like you're getting stale with something, take a look out there. Instead of doing a Venn diagram, go find something new to try on the Project Zero. It's a great place to use any kind of primary source to do different thinking routines with your kids.
Yeah, and it would be really great to look at some of those thinking routines and really consider some of what we shared earlier around being culturally responsive and thinking about the types of routines and information processing strategies your students are already coming into the classroom with. So again, if they're coming from communities with oral traditions like Native communities, how are you bringing in those deep listening, those deep observational, those oral in the sense of speaking skills, that how you could find some thinking routines in there that leverage those strengths specifically. So we really encourage you to check that out.
So we're going to try to do a thinking routine with you. This one is called Circle of Viewpoints. So here we have a primary source that Helen found. It is from Frank Leslie's Illustrated Newspaper. And if you look at the bottom, and in fact, the transcription is covering it, but it says, educating the Indians, a female pupil of the government school at Carlisle visits her home at Pine Ridge And now it's covered. I can't read what the
Oh,
rest
it says, visits her home at Pine Ridge Agency from a sketch by a corresponding artist. And for those that are unfamiliar, Pine Ridge is a reservation in South Dakota. That I'm not biased, but it is Lakota people like myself. So just for context, we do want to be mindful about what context we provide to learners when we're showing them an image like this.
Exactly. So the first thing that we would do is just in the chat, if you could for me, brainstorm from just looking at this primary source, right? Look at it and just what different perspectives of people would you see using this source if you use this? Just a list of the different perspectives. And you could just put one perspective and we can get a whole bunch of people putting different ones in there. Perfect. So the female student would have one perspective, her family would have another. The tribal elders, the children, the female student, good. Anyone else have the artist? Thank you. I was hoping someone would point that out, right? Frank Leslie or whoever that he or she is, right? They have a perspective too, right? Tribal women and the children. Yeah, so they may have a different perspective as opposed to a woman that doesn't have a child with her, right? Because we don't necessarily know that. So it's the idea of looking at this image, right? And then figuring out what are all the different perspectives of the people or things in this picture.
Yeah.
So then the next, oh, go ahead, Helen.
I was just going to say that's a great point where you said people or things, because one thing about Indigenous people often is that they will do perspective taking, again, like I said, with non-human beings as well. So that's a great way to encourage your students to consider other ways of thinking and being, is when there's an image that includes maybe animals or different landways or waterways, how encouraging them to consider those perspectives as well. Sorry, go right ahead, Linda.
Yeah, no. So then after you brainstorm a list of the different perspectives, then you have your students choose one perspective to explore. And so you can give them sentence starters like this, especially in middle school. I find sentence starters will help kids kind of get their thinking, especially because they haven't necessarily been trained in the use of inquiry from beginning. And we all know social studies is kind of marginalized in elementary schools. So sentence starters can be a really good way. So you can use one that says, I'm thinking of, whatever topic from the viewpoint of, I'm the young woman in the dress coming home, or I think this, and they're like playing an actor of from that point of view. A question that I have from this point of view is this. And so these are just different sentence starters that can get the kids really thinking of those multiple perspectives, which is something that is required by our social studies standards. One note though, with doing things like this, you do want to be mindful about not perpetuating negative stereotypes, and just make sure that you're kind of on top of your kids, especially as maybe they haven't done this sort of activity in the past. So that is something to be mindful of. And then here's a link directly to that. And as Helen mentioned, I did a training off that Project Zero. There's one called Parts, Perspectives, and Me. And so I had a picture of a beaver dam in Flagstaff. I was doing training for Flagstaff. And so we were looking at all the different perspectives, right? And so you can say, well, what is the perspective of the beaver that's building this dam? And then what is the perspective of the eagle that's watching down, and the fish in the river, and the people that are hiking along the side? Like looking at all the different points of view and perspectives, and then what would their point of view be? And then we did that also, and then looked at, say, dam building on the Colorado, and what does that bring in? And so it is just that idea of just getting kids to think about the world in maybe a different way from the dominant narrative is a good way to do and use a lot of these different kinds of thinking routines from this website.
Yeah, and I think Linda's point around being mindful of where bias or stereotypes could come up is really important when we're talking about Indigenous perspectives, knowing that they've been historically either erased from our curriculum or from our instruction, or when they are represented, often, as I said earlier, misrepresented. So again, I would love to call us back to that idea of portraying Indigenous peoples with agency. This is one way to take on that perspective and really consider from an Indigenous person's point of view what might be their perspective. And then even in this image, seeing the diversity of perspectives within Indigenous communities as well.
And the idea of making that the connections to today as well. And that gets to Helen's agency piece of this, right? So you can use this on all different kinds of issues, dilemmas, and it opens up those kinds of discussions on kind of controversial issues, right? And this is why we use primary sources. You know, it provides our students, you know, accurate history, but also gets them thinking about something else. And then again, wanting to relate it to themselves today. You know, how would you think, you know, have you been in a situation where you felt like the outsider, or you felt like maybe you didn't fit in, or, you know, something was taken from you? And so those kinds of perspectives and connections are what we want to do, again, to make it relevant and not teach about Indigenous peoples solely in the past.
Yep, and those connections to the information literacy and the idea of asking questions from the point of view, like what was the artist trying to convey by creating this image, I think would just lead to really meaningful discussions. Okay, I think we have just a few more types of primary sources we'd love to highlight. And so I'm going to pass it back to Linda for the next
So
slide.
the next thing we wanted to show you, and I'm not going to get into this and read it, but you'll see it on the presentation, is using quotes. So do not shy away from taking a text or document and excerpting it down to just use a small quote to have your students analyze it. This is a great way that you can make it more manageable, especially for students on IEPs or lower reading level students. And you're using it for educational purposes, and that's totally fine. You can also take primary sources and kind of reword them and summarize them for your students too. That is perfectly acceptable as well, as long as you're not publishing it. So those are options that we also like to do, but just be also mindful that when you do quotes and you do paraphrase sources, make sure you're giving your kids that sourcing information. Again, so they can look up and see, well, what was the point of view of Frank, that illustrator in the last one, right? What was he trying to do by showing this young woman going back to her home? Like there was a message he was trying to convey. So making sure that your students know the source and start investigating that source and figuring out laterally what other people think about the same thing is a really important concept to get across.
And then lastly, of course, we want to again highlight the Federal Investigative Report as a super relevant contemporary primary source. And so we've referenced this throughout our session today as including maps, including a really great narrative report, right, with information that's been researched by the federal government. We also want to highlight that the appendix includes briefs on all 408 identified federal Indian boarding school sites that we saw the dots of earlier. And we've shared that the report, I'm sorry. So on this slide, I've highlighted a particular one of the briefs from the Wide Ruins boarding school in Wide Ruins, Arizona. And what's great is this is where you could go to then dig deeper into those boarding schools that you've identified are closest to where you're learning, right? If you want to start with that local context and then zoom out. And what's really helpful is that they include, someone asked earlier, posed a question around what kind of funding they received, who was operating it. And so they do have information around possible other names, other associated schools, the address, the start date, the end date. You can see the end date for this school is open because it's still currently operating. And I chose this school specifically because it's currently operating as a tribally controlled BIE school. And so this is another great way to showcase agency, to show that in the current era of federal Indian policy that we're in, of government to government relations, relationships, tribal nations are now able to take control of these schools in their on their reservations and run them through tribally controlled operation and allow more culturally responsive or sustaining practices to be incorporated into their schooling for their citizens. So this is a great way to touch on tribal sovereignty and governance in a contemporary context as well. And so they also have general notes, the type of school that it's at. And I know the federal investigative report had particular criteria that they were using to define what a federal Indian boarding school is. And so that would also be interesting to explore with your students. And this is linked just like everything else so that you all can access that after our time together today.
So using multimedia resources like videos and podcasts are another fantastic way to, one, promote that kind of information and media literacy that we really need to be mindful of, especially with middle school kids as they get on, social media platforms all over the place. Additionally, using these types of resources can again be ways to incorporate oral traditions into your instruction, bringing in some more of those Indigenous ways of knowing and being. And lastly, using videos and podcasts made by or with Indigenous peoples are a great way to bring in those multiple perspectives into your lessons. So we're going to show you just a few resources that you can find for videos and podcasts for middle and high school students.
Yeah, and to that last point, in our other series for this summer, we really advocated for partnering with local community experts, bringing them into your classroom. So we know that that's not always feasible or possible. And so we're offering using videos and podcasts as a great alternative to have voices in your classroom without maybe necessarily having to bring them. And so in our collection that we'll be sharing in just a few minutes for all these resources, we've included videos from the Heard Museum here in Phoenix, which has a wonderful longstanding exhibit on the boarding schools. And throughout that exhibit, which would be amazing for you all to experience with your students or to experience yourself, they've kind of moved everything into a digital environment so that you can virtually go through the exhibit, and it has a number of videos, and these are quick clips, like 1-minute clips that showcase Indigenous experts, scholars, researchers, boarding school survivors speaking to their experiences in the school. So this particular one is talking about the outing program, which was, again, as we learned in part 1, that aspect of the boarding schools where students could be checked out by non-native peoples to perform manual labor, right? We also want to highlight this documentary from PBS Utah that's called Unspoken: America's Native American Boarding Schools, which again is just another great way to bring in, you could show experts excerpts of the video to bring in additional perspectives. But there are some other, beyond just documentaries and videos for exhibits, other types of videos that you could be bringing in. For example, you could show this PBS NewsHour clip that's Secretary Deb Haaland from Laguna Pueblo being interviewed on healing from the indoctrination and the dehumanization of Indian boarding schools, and speaking to why the federal government now has this initiative to investigate the federal Indian boarding schools. We also want to highlight this. It's a website that was created through the National Museum of the American Indian and their Native Knowledge 360 initiative. And the lesson plan, the lesson website, is actually about Native American code talkers, right? So if you're not familiar, code talkers are Native American veterans who use their Indigenous languages to create codes for the federal government in World War I and II. And these people represent tribal nations from actually over 30 different tribes, although just a few specific tribes tend to get credited or talked about. And this lesson does a great job of putting in that history, making connections to the boarding school movement and how a lot of these code talkers also went to boarding schools, and just what was that experience like of having your language, right, devalued in the boarding school, but then needing to use your language and seeing it as an asset, right, in the military. So that's another unique way to frame this topic that you could bring in for your students, and kind of brings in that global perspective that I know is emphasized in the middle school. And then lastly, the Carlisle Indian School Research Project has an Indian School Research podcast that you could use to highlight some of the experiences in the history of boarding schools. And I'm sorry, I didn't mention that this website includes a number of audio clips of audio interviews, and that's why we included it in this video and kind of podcasts section. So we encourage you to check those out and use them in your classroom. But I really love the idea of using contemporary news clips, because it just brings the relevance of this topic into today, knowing that this is something that Indigenous people have been advocating for a long time, that's really making some big movements recently.
So lastly, we wanted to really talk about lesson plans. And so we recognize that as classroom teachers, right, you have a lot on your plate already. And so we wanted to ensure that we were highlighting some ready to use lesson plans that you can just insert into your scope and sequences in the current curriculum that you use. Before we give you some specific examples, we wanted to again emphasize the importance of using resources that were created with or by Indigenous peoples and organizations, and also make sure that you do review those resources and stuff before you actually use them in the classroom, just so that way you can avoid any difficulties or traumas that you may have. So here are some middle school lesson plans. Again, like Helen had mentioned, there are lots of them all over the place that you can get. PBS, the National Parks has some great lesson plans. Other states have done lesson plans, like Oregon Department of Education has got some stuff that you can use. I know like the state of Colorado has done some, South and North Dakota have done great jobs of getting like elders involved. And so there are lots of resources out there already that you can do. And the Native American Education for All resources is another great place where you can get middle school specific lessons. Again, some of those government sites that we talked about earlier, like the Museum for the American Indian, is also another place that has pre-done lessons that you can find for teaching about some of these topics.
Yes, and one thing to highlight about the Native American Education for All resources, we know this can be somewhat of a contentious topic in the sense that it brings up a lot of emotions, right? And one thing I appreciate about this is their resources are really, they can be used in the classroom, but they can also be adapted to be used at home with families. And so they're a great thing to kind of use as a possible extension activity to bring in some family engagement into this topic, and give students and families the opportunity to have some meaningful conversations outside the classroom as well. And to Linda's point around the work that's being done in North and South Dakota, it's linked in one of our other resource collections, but we can bring it into this one as well. North Dakota has done a wonderful job of interviewing elders for a lot of their resources. And so that's another option for videos and podcasts. Professor Pino highlighted yesterday in our session yesterday that the federal government has begun their testimonial process, where they're traveling around the country to hear testimonials from survivors in all regions of the United States. And so trying to find some of those recordings or resources could also be a really genuine way to bring in perspectives from survivors to where they get to tell their stories in their own words. And lastly, we'd like to highlight the Truth in Healing curriculum from the Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition, which is a Native American focused organization that promotes truth and healing around Native American boarding schools. And so this asset-based curriculum is available in elementary, middle, and high school options for free. You just have to go to their website and request it. And the curriculum includes 4 lessons on Indian boarding schools covering history and impacts, which are what we focused our part 1 session on, but then also stories and healing. And we really appreciate that they're centering healing and that moving forward, that revitalization But each lesson includes an into, through, and beyond sequence that allows students to learn really through inquiry and exploration, and then encourages them to deepen their learning through extensions. They also have some of the unique connections that they make to other topics. For example, boarding schools and pandemics. That's something that I haven't seen any other lesson plans making any explicit connections to, although it would feel probably very relevant to our Indigenous students. And it's also really intentional given the disproportionate impacts that the COVID-19 pandemic has had on Native American communities, and the way that it's brought an increased sense of urgency to language revitalization, given that many of our language speakers in Indigenous communities are elders, unfortunately, who were being impacted by the pandemic. We also want to highlight that this particular curriculum has great word definitions for phrases that aren't necessarily always included in other resources. So things like intergenerational trauma, but also bringing in that strengths-based approach of accompanying that with intergenerational wisdom, right? And what's are the positive things that get passed down intergenerationally, not just some of the negatives, which you know Native people are typically portrayed in that way. I also have definitions for land cession, assimilation. And so we encourage you to take a look at this resource, which will be linked in our resource collection.
So now we want to take a minute and really show how Native American boarding schools integrate with the Arizona Social Studies standards. So in the chat, I'm going to have you just pick a number for me and guess, you know, if you're a sixth grade teacher, knowing your standards for sixth grade or seventh grade, eighth grade, how many standards do you think would be addressed by teaching about Native American boarding schools in your classroom? So if you can just type a number into the chat for me. Let's see, we have 15. Greater than 13. Lots. I'm assuming that's what the plus would be. Yes. So Sarah, you bring up a good point that my colleague that teaches ELA says you can teach the ELA standards using a cereal box, which is very true. And I emphasize this for the younger grades that you may hit, you know, 13 social studies standards when you're teaching a lesson like this, but then you're also hitting 10 or 11 ELA standards as far as like what kind of reading and writing that you're doing with it. So definitely there are many, many standards. So we're going to look at the standards and show kind of where are some of the applicable places. Now you would think with Native American boarding schools, it doesn't really fit with the sixth grade scope and sequence because it is prior to the time, but there are ways in which you can, as a sixth grade teacher teaching world history, set up some of the ideas and understandings for Indigenous peoples prior to contact with European. And so ideas of, you know, the growth of trade networks, you can talk about Indigenous trade networks to really highlight what was life like in the Americas prior to Europeans coming here, right? What was the population like? What were trade networks that like? We talk about like the Turquoise Road from Central America coming up into the Southwest, right? So the goods, the trades, the languages, all of that gets spread using trade networks is a great way to talk about Indigenous peoples, kind of setting that framework. And also setting up the idea of governments kind of controlling things. And so you can see that setting the stage really is how you can look at it in a sixth grade setting and understanding that, you know, the Maori and the Indigenous Hawaiian peoples and all of that had governments prior to white Europeans, you know, coming to the different places around the world and forcing their form of government on others. So definitely it's not necessarily as obvious in sixth grade, but you can make some of those connections like what we said. So then going into 7th grade, it's obviously going to be definitely something that you can cover because you're looking at US history, but not just US history. It's really global history with kind of a US emphasis. So this is where I think it would be a phenomenal place to compare Native American boarding schools in the US with Native Americans, or not Native American, with Indigenous schools in, say, New Zealand, in Australia, in Canada, right? What happened to those peoples? What happened to the Indigenous Mayans in Central America? Do they, how do they live today? How has their life changed? How has it been the same? So there are a lot of those ideas. You can also talk about Indigenous peoples coming to with World War I and World War II, as far as we talk about Indigenous contributions to the military. But another one that you may not think about is the idea that many of these Indigenous boarding schools, especially on the West Coast, were then used as Japanese incarceration camps during World War II. And so that connection between AAPI history and Indigenous peoples history, I think, is a great connection to make. And again, looking at those federal policies of how did that make that connection and did that happen elsewhere in the world? So you can see we have a ton. Any of the SPs, which are our inquiry standards, hit with them. The civics, economics, the geography about movement and people, displaced peoples, right? When you talk about refugees, you can also bring that back with Indigenous peoples and how do they feel? The fact that, like, for example, the state of Colorado has 2 federally recognized tribes, but yet it had, dozens of tribes prior to there, but most of them got forced off of their land in Colorado and forced to move to Oklahoma. So it's a different situation, say, than what we have in Arizona, where we have 22 federally recognized tribes. So making those kinds of connections, I think, is important and good going forward. And 7th grade is a great place to do. 8th grade, the entire year is all about government and civics, right? And it's this beautiful capstone year of everything the kids have learned in elementary and middle school. Now, what are you going to do with it, right? Channel that crazy, wicked 8th grade energy to be a force for good, right? We know these kids are squirrely and we know they want to be, do something, and they want to be felt like they're heard and important. So what a great way to talk about some of these issues today with Indigenous peoples and some of that healing and that needs to come from what happened with Native American boarding schools and how is the government dealing with it today. And so you can look at the Department of the Interior and all the things that Deb Haaland is doing with them. And even in the state of Arizona, for example, they just passed a law to really go back and look at with, I think it's called LIDAR, where you go back and really examine the grounds around these boarding schools in Arizona to make sure that there aren't any unmarked graves, that these bones need to be repatriated with their peoples, like what you had, that horrific finding in Canada. So there are lots of ways that you can bring this into your lessons and bring these voices today, showing that strength and resiliency, and also going forward from that trauma in the past. So 8th grade's a fantastic year.
And I think to that point, Linda, around why we feel it's so important that all students are learning about this topic is that regardless of whether you are Indigenous or you're not Indigenous, really thinking about what is your responsibility, what role can you play in that healing and that revitalizing, because many Indigenous peoples, advocates, and activists have shared that it does take solidarity across communities for some of these shifts to happen. So what a great way, regardless of what your school context is in, whether you're in a high density school where most of your students are Native, identify as Native, or you're in a low density school where most of your students do not identify as Native, I think it would be really great to consider how you can move into that informed action, right, that we see advocated for in many social studies instruction. Okay. So we are so grateful for you all taking the time to engage with those protocols, those strategies, those resources. And we now want to give you some time to reflect on everything we've shared today. We dropped the Wakelet link of resources. So it's just one link that's going to have hyperlinks to everything we mentioned today, all the lesson plans, all the resources, all the websites with tools And we're going to send you back into your small groups. Again, please use that talking circle protocol of allowing each person to share their response, and really consider, what are you taking away from our time together today? How are you going to apply what you've learned? What connections are you making to your specific context and classroom? And you'll see that we dropped a link to a slide deck. Please use the slide that corresponds to your breakout room number. So if you're in breakout room 1, you'll go to slide 1. If you're in breakout room 2, you go to slide 2, etc. And then just, document some of what you all are discussing, some of what you shared, what you're walking away with. And we're able to give you about 10 minutes to do that. And then we will come together, actually maybe 9 minutes, and then we'll come back together and really close our time together with some reflections and next steps for supporting each other in this work. So with that, I will let Linda open up the breakout rooms.
All right.
All right, thank you so much for taking that time to engage with each other. Again, build relationships. A big part of working in those small group times for us was building the sense of community, right, of educators who are committed to teaching about this topic, bringing in these perspectives. And so we hope you're feeling that sense of community when you're in those small group discussions. And so if anyone has any, aha moments, anything that was shared in their group that they think would benefit the larger group, or if you were unable to add to the slide deck because you're on a mobile device, you can definitely add your reflections into the chat right now. But we actually are going to take just a minute or so, and maybe this could be a 1-word takeaway. This could be a few words, doesn't have to be a complete sentence, but what did you learn? What did you learn today? What are you walking away with? Really just summarizing everything you just talked about in your small group. Or if there's any questions that are still lingering with you that would help us plan for how to continue to support educators who are interested in teaching about this topic. Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing in the chat. I love that this idea of using Indigenous ways of knowing is resonating with people. I see people saying that they're interested in thinking about incorporating that into their classroom on a more systemic level. Audio recordings, resources, looking forward to digging through everything. We definitely appreciate all that. And so we do want to quickly close our time with one. We'll drop a survey in the chat. But I also am going to let Linda speak to our community of practice, which we're hoping you will join us at.
So we are super excited, again, modeling that idea of Indigenous ways of knowing and being. So Helen and I would like to create a community of practice with everyone, and you don't have to have attended any of these summer sessions. So if you have colleagues that would like to join us, what we'd like to do, and we will be sending this out a little bit later. We haven't formalized the date yet, but what we'd like to do is meet with you once a quarter. And so just a secondary teacher, so it's going to be 6 through 12, where we get together to discuss how you've been able to maybe incorporate some of these practices, Indigenous ways of knowing and being, or incorporating Native American boarding schools, or even just bringing in multiple perspectives and primary sources, right? What are some of the great successes that you've had to celebrate those? And then also maybe what are some of the challenges that you've had, or struggles that you have, or barriers that you've had? Maybe if admin is, asking you not to do certain things, how do you get around that? And just those things that come up, we want to make sure that we're creating that community of support for you. And so that's really where we are at with this. And so we'd like to just maybe touch base once a quarter with you and have you join us for just a really informal talking circle where we can come together and share and support one another going forward in this endeavor that we're creating. We did put a survey link into the chat. Helen can post that in there again. Please, we ask that you complete the survey. This training, like we said, was in partnership with the Phoenix Indian Visitors School Center and the Native American Association, and this is provided from a grant. And so in doing this, we'd like to give them information back on how successful this was. So any survey link you have going forward, we also are available to come out and do trainings to your schools in person. We ask that you do we asked that it be about 20 people attend. So it could be something if your whole school or ELA and social studies teachers get together. It's a great way that we can talk about incorporating those. We've done trainings with our secondary ELA specialist, who's also just a guru at incorporating diverse perspectives and Indigenous voices. We have the Office of Indian Education and ELA are coming out with Indigenous voices for literature. And so there's a lot that we have going on. So definitely keep in touch with us. For attendance purposes, I'd ask that you put your first and last name into the chat, please, so I can verify your attendance. It will mark that you are attended but not complete until I go in and fix the attendance. When you get that email from me, that's when you will get the PDF. I'll save the chat so you have the chat as well with all of the resources. And all our contact information is out there on that. And I'm going to let Helen talk about some of the great things she's got going on for the fall. And I want to thank you all so much for coming and spending your time with us today. And I'll let Helen say goodbye. And
thank
that's
you.
it.
I did see someone ask, how do you sign up for the community of practice? So in Linda's follow-up email, when she confirms that your attendance has been marked, she's also going to include links to sign up for the social studies newsletter and then for the Office of Indian Education's professional learning email list. And so if you sign up for those two or either or of those, you will be the first to know when we've determined our community of practice dates, how to register, how to make sure that you get that Zoom link so that you can join us at that time. We would be so grateful to have you in the space. We really do value all the knowledge and the expertise you all bring into the space, and we want to create a professional learning opportunity that builds on that and gives you the chance to learn not just from us, but with us and with each other in there. So I just want to close with saying Pilama Yaye, thank you so much for being here today. Super grateful that there are educators in our state like you all who are committed to this type of learning.
Okay, I'm going to stop.